Miriam, and I was born a slave. I was born in a city called Goshen in Egypt, and I'm of the Hebrews. So about 400 years ago, our people as a tribe came here during a famine, and we were given great comfort, and we were given a city, and they welcomed us. But the Pharaoh who did that is long gone, and the new Pharaoh fears our people. He's afraid of the numbers. He's worried that one day we'll rise up against him. And so gradually over the last 100 years, he's enslaved us. He's taken away our rights as a people. We have no freedom of choice. We simply have to do exactly as we are told. And our life is, at best, boring and mundane. And at worst, it's a life of sorrow. For this new Pharaoh is so worried about the numbers of the Hebrew that he's passed a law that when a baby boy is born to our people, he must be thrown to drown in the river Nile. So our land is a land of crying mothers, their hearts breaking for their sons, fathers with sorrow in their eyes, going to make bricks for this Pharaoh who destroys our people. And when I was about 5 years old, my little brother Aaron was about 3, and our mother told us that she was pregnant. And what should have been a joyous, incredible moment was anything. For the deep worry of her heart, if it's a boy, they will take him from you and kill him. And so she carried this child, and her time came to deliver. And quietly we sent for the Hebrew midwives. Because even they had been told by Pharaoh, if it's a boy and you are there, you will throw it in the river Nile. But you know, they honored God more than they honored the Pharaoh God. And so they did not tell Pharaoh when boys were born. They told him, oh, these Hebrew women, they give birth so quickly and easily, they don't call on us. But they came to help him. And when the Hebrew brother was born, they left quietly in the dark, not saying a word. And in her heart, my mother knew there was something about this baby, this precious, this gift from God himself. And so they hid him. And as a family, we kept quiet about this baby. But after a few months, his lungs got bigger, and he was no. And my mother feared that they would find him and kill him. So she tearfully, prayerfully, she took papyrus reeds and she wove a little basket, a little boat, a little ark. And she covered it in pitch and tar to make it waterproof. And then with me carrying that, she carried her son down to the river Nile. And with tears pouring down her face, she wrapped him in a blanket, and she kissed this precious child, and she put him in this basket. And she prayed God would protect this boy. And she left, putting him down in the river and amongst the reeds. But I stayed and watched. And as I watched from a hiding place, just seeing what would happen when he woke, who would find him. And then I saw Pharaoh's daughter approaching with her whole entourage, and their white robes flapped against their brown legs, and you could smell their scent before you saw them, and their laughter wafted across on a breeze. And I think they were coming to bathe in the river. But as they stood at the side, Pharaoh's daughter looked across into the reeds, and she could see that it worked. And she pointed her finger and sent a slave to go and fetch it up the river. And as the woman picked up the basket, her movement must have woken this baby. And he started to cry. And she carried this child to Pharaoh's daughter. And as Pharaoh's daughter opened that blanket and saw the face, something about those dark rimmed eyes under that heavy fringe changed, and they softened. And a small smile touched her face as she reached her hand in and unwrapped this child. And she said, this is a Hebrew tribe. For he was circumcised, and you could see he was Hebrew. Without thinking, I ran from where I was hiding, and I said, I can find a Hebrew woman to nurse your child for you. And she looked, with an imperious tint of her chin, she said, go and fetch this woman. And I ran as fast as those skinny little legs would carry me. Went to find my mom. And I told her what had happened, and together she held my hand and we ran. Smiles, tears of joy running down her face, and she came and stood before Pharaoh's daughter. Pharaoh's daughter looked up and said, you'll do. I'll pay you to raise this child. Until he is weaned, you take care of him, and nobody will touch this child. And with that she turned and swayed back with her entourage to the palace. And we were left looking at each other. How gracious is the hand of God. He has saved our son. And the king who wants him dead, his own daughter, is standing protection over this little boy. And so for the next few years, as a family, we lavished love on this child. For we knew he would have to return to the queen. But for now, it was ours. And until the day he was weaned, my parents poured their love into him. A lifetime of love into a short space of time. And my mum won't speak about that day when we had to walk to the palace and hand over her youngest child. And he walked beside us holding my hand. And my heart broke. I got used to his little body tucked in next to my mom. And those belly laughs. And just his little piping voice. But he lived. And it would be a long time before we saw it. We watched him grow from afar. We heard rumors. He was being raised as the crown prince. He was being trained in the art of politics, the art of war, in culture and history and art. Once we even thought we saw his chariot going past as we were digging in the mud. Him on his way to the turquoise mines to stamp out a rebellion. And then, after 40 years, we were horrified. We heard that my little brother was on the run from Pharaoh. For he had gone out and he had seen one of the guards whipping a Hebrew slave. And he had confronted the man and he had killed him. And now he fled for his very life. Was this the end? What was this about? All these years we'd watched from afar, and now he was a refugee escaping into the desert from Pharaoh's wrath. And another 40 years passed. 40 years of Pharaoh's cruelty. 40 years of whips and slavery. 40 years of our children dying. And as a people we cried out, Yahweh, where are you? Save us from this. Yahweh, what are you doing? Our elders and our priests cried out before God. And he heard nothing. And then one day, my other brother Aaron, who's just younger than me, felt called by God to go into the desert. And when he came back with another man. And this man had grey hair. He was also in his 80s. And he had a long grey beard. I knew. Because my little brother Moses returned to us. And I dropped what I was doing and I just ran and I threw my arms around him with tears of joy. He restored to me. What are you doing here? And then Mum came in and it was such a family reunion. And he told us how he had fled. And God had provided even in that desert. He had come to a well and he had met a group of young women who had taken him home to their father, Jethro's house. And Jethro happens to be a descendant of Abraham, just like us. And he had welcomed him in. And he had married one of Jethro's own daughters. and become a shepherd. And the lands that he had crossed in a chariot, he had learned to survive in. He learned the ways of the desert. He learned the ways of a shepherd, caring, pasturing, looking after, patience. He learned where to find water, where to find food, how to find shelter in the desert. And he had 2 sons, 2 boys to our Moses. And he said one day he had been at a place called Mount Sinai. And as he was sitting there just tending his sheep, he had noticed over there a burning bush. But it burnt and the fire did not consume it. So he went across to see what was this about. And he had heard the very voice of Yahweh from inside this bush, telling him, remove your sandals, you're on holy ground. And he had removed his sandals, and God had spoken to him and told him that he wanted Moses to return to us, for he had heard our heart cry from in Egypt. And he wanted Moses to be the instrument to lead us out of the slavery in Egypt, back to the land he had given Jacob, the land of Canaan. I stood there in awe as we heard this story. Was this why God had saved that tiny baby 80 years before? So that he could lead the Hebrew people back to the land that God had told them to be in. And he told us I had asked for Aaron's help, for he was afraid to go before Pharaoh. And the 2 of them wanted the backing of the elders of our tribe, which is mainly the Levites. So they had gone, and I sat there with my mom just thinking of the things he had told us. Staffs that turned into snakes and back into staffs. Leprous hands that cured immediately. It was mind-blowing. And this little hope fired up within me. God remembered his people. He had not forgotten us. And Aaron and Moses came back, and I don't know what had happened, but the elders had said they would go with before Pharaoh. And Moses told us that already he knew Pharaoh's heart was hard. So he was going to go before Pharaoh and just ask, could we go for 3 days into the desert and worship our God? And he knew Pharaoh was going to say no. For God had said, Pharaoh's heart was so hard, but God was stronger than Pharaoh. And he would bring down every one of those Egyptian gods and show Pharaoh who was the true God, who was the true creator and almighty God. And so they went before Pharaoh. And as women, we were not allowed in. So my mother and I waited outside. And when the men came out, you could see on their faces it had not gone well. For not only had Pharaoh said no, but he said, if your people are so lazy, they think they need a 3-day holiday, they obviously don't have enough work, do they? So, same number of bricks, find your own straw. And we scrambled. Even little ones in nappies were taken out into the fields to gather the straw. But eventually, close by was done. And the time it took to go and gather and bring it in could not keep up the quotas. So the whips fell on everyone. Even the overseers went and begged Pharaoh, this is an impossible task. He said, no, it's not. They're just lazy. Beat them. And then started a series of unbelievable events that our people will talk about for generations, for thousands of years. For God's hand moved against the Egyptians. And he sent Moses and Aaron back time and time again before Pharaoh. And he took out all of their gods. From turning staffs into serpents, to turning the very river Nile, their source of life and their God, into blood. And then frogs came up out of the water. And when they died, they piled high, this high, stinking masses of dirty, dying frogs. And Pharaoh would change his mind and say, yes, I will let your people go. But as soon as the plague ended, he would change his mind. And it was just a series of plagues, flying gnats, flies. The livestock died. Not where we lived. For God's hand was over his people. And in the city of Gohen, no livestock died. No frogs came, no locusts. The fire and hail did not fall where we were. The Egyptians were covered in pustulating boils, so painful they could not move, but not to the Hebrews. Fire and hail and darkness that fell over the land for 3 days and 3 nights. And still Pharaoh's heart was hard and he would not relent. And then Moses told us that God had said the final plague was coming. And with this plague, Pharaoh would beg us to leave. But we had to prepare for this plague. And on the 10th day of the month, each family went and we found a perfect male lamb. And we had to sacrifice that lamb and take the blood and put it across the doorposts using a hyssop branch. And then we roasted those lambs with bitter herbs. And that night we were told, stay in your homes, do not leave. Eat your roasted lamb. Stay with your coats girdled. Keep your sandals on. Make unleavened bread for a journey. Be prepared to leave, for tonight God will come to the entire city and country of Egypt. And he will kill every firstborn child of both man and livestock, unless you are protected by the doorposts covered in the sacrificial lamb's blood. And we did exactly as Moses said. And the city was quiet as we hurriedly ate the meat. And we burnt the leftovers. And we waited. And then we heard from outside the city walls a wailing and a crying, a sorrow that we had known for decades as the firstborn son of every Egyptian home died. From the lowest slave to Pharaoh himself. And while it was still dark, he sent for my brothers. He said, take your people and get out of here. And Moses told all of us, go to your neighbors, tell them to give them gold, silver, and fabrics for your journey. And they gladly gave us. They said to us, please leave before we all die, for your God is a powerful God. And so we packed our unleavened bread in cloths. We took their jewelry and their clothes, and we left Egypt. Our hearts as we walked, a group of slaves, 400 years, and God had rescued us by incredible signs and the power of his hands, and our hearts were wild with joy. And as we walked, we eventually came to just before the desert, the Sea of Reeds. And as we prepared to cross it, we made camp there for the night. And the next morning, when I got up, we looked out over the horizon and there was a dust cloud. And then we could hear chariot wheels. We heard the jingle of harnesses. We could see the glint of spears. For once again, Pharaoh was not true to his word, and he had sent his entire army out. Better we be dead than free. And we were trapped between the river and the army. And the people turned to Moses, angry. Did you bring us out here just to die here in the desert? And Moses said, trust in God's provision and redemption and deliverance, and watch what he will do. And he lifted his staff over that river, and the sea parted into 2 walls higher than we stood, and the entire nation walked through on dry sand. Livestock, the elderly, the children, everybody. And as the last Hebrew lifted their foot from the river, Moses dropped his arm, and as the army arrived, their wheels going straight into the sand, the water started to come back down, and their wheels got stuck. And the panic you could see on their face. And Moses said, you will never see these Egyptians again, as the water came with a deafening crash and destroyed the Egyptian army. And you know, we stood on the side of the river and I looked at my baby brother and we started to sing. For God is a great and glorious God, horse and rider thrown into the sea. And I grabbed a tambourine and with all the women we began to dance and shout and praise to Yahweh, the Almighty God. And that jubilation lasted as we headed into the desert. For we had to go south first, for Moses wanted to lead us to Mount Sinai to worship God, where he had first spoken to him from that burning bush. And at first it was exciting. But you know, we'd been brought up next to the Nile. We weren't used to desert. Moses understood it. We drank our water too quickly, and soon we had none. And the people began to complain. They began to complain to Moses and Aaron. They began to blame Moses and Aaron. Why did you bring us into the wilderness to die? At least we had water at the Nile. What have we got here? Heat and death. You know, when you wake up and there's this red ball of fire in the sky, you just say, not even dew that you can collect to wet your mouth. When you're so thirsty, your tongue is stuck against the roof of your mouth and your lips are bleeding. You can get quite angry. And the people complain. And on about the third day, as we were walking, I saw palm trees. Now, where there's a palm tree, there's water, right? I ran. I thought I'll help the elder later, and I just ran. And as I scooped some of the water up and I put it in my mouth, I just spat it out. It was bitter and oily. In fact, you know, when you're trying to get it out of your mouth, that horrible, acrid taste. And I wasn't the only one. And the people's relief turned to anger. And again, they blamed Moses. How could you bring us here? And Moses cried out to God, as he always did. And God told him to take a branch from over there, to break it, so that the sap was released, and he threw it into the water. And as the branch sunk in the water, he said, now you can drink. And I did. And it still wasn't great, but it was better. You could swallow it. You know, we drank that water. And to be polite, it went through us fast. And not pleasantly. But all the parasites, all the gastric problems we'd had in Egypt disappeared as we drank the bitter water of Nile. And God said he has tested us. Will we trust him, even when the bitter water is something you need? We didn't stay there long. We moved on. We eventually came to the place of the 12 palms and sprites. And we stayed there a while. For the dates were sweet and the water was sweet, and we could refresh and renew our souls. And then we headed back out into the desert on our way to Mount Sinai. Sweetie, don't you want to sit over there out the shade? In the shade? You can sit on my chair. Are you sure? That sun is hot, right? We had that day in and day out, this intense heat. And once again, water was running low. Food had run out. Unleavened bread only lasts so long with so many people. And the people began to grumble and complain. And they began to long for the food that we had in Egypt. For there we had plenty of meat. Even if it was meat that had been offered to others, we had plenty. And they complained. And Moses went before the Lord. God is so gracious and kind. He said to us, tonight I will send you quail. Quail are these tiny little birds. You know, they just landed everywhere throughout our settlement. You could just go pick them up. It tasted so good after just unleavened bread. And the next morning, when we woke up, there was this strange white dew on the ground. And as the sun warmed it, it dried into these white flakes. And we went to pick it up and we said, what is it? And so we called the stuff manna. And it was God's own provision. You know, it looked like coriander seeds, and you could grind it up, and it made bread that tasted like honey. And do you know that man for 40 years? 40 years, every day except the Sunday. And I think it was God's way of discipline. Because you had to get up early to collect your manna. If you waited too late, it evaporated. If you collected too much, it rotted and the maggots crept out. But before the Sabbath, you could collect enough for 2 days. For God wanted us to honor the Sabbath as a day of grace. And we were fed, and you know, our shoes they never wore out as we walked through the desert. God was so kind. Once again, you'd think we would learn and stop complaining, but we ran out of water, and the people complained. And God told Moses to take his staff and strike a rock, and from that rock flowed a reservoir of sweet water, enough for us. And eventually we came to Mount Sinai, and we made camp. We were there for 2 years. And there's a part of our history that we're not very proud of as a nation, but we can't only tell you the good bits. When we got to Mount Sinai, God told us not to go up the mountain, for his very presence was there. And Moses went up to speak to him. And he'd been gone an awfully long time. It was 40 days. How can he still be alive? You know, there's thunder and lightning and fire going on up there. Maybe he's being consumed. And I stayed out of this one. But the people went to Aaron because he had been left in charge. Not wise. They should have asked me, right? Because the people went to Aaron, the priest, and said, we think Moses is gone. Make for us a God like we had in Egypt, that we can worship, something tangible we can touch and see. It will help us to get through this next bit. So Aaron said, give me your jewelry, give me your gold, your rings, your earrings. And he melted them down. And he made a calf of gold. And the people, and they began to worship this calf. And I don't know if you've been in Egypt, but the way they worship is immoral. It's about sexual acts and wildness and debauchery. And I stayed in my tent. But as it was happening, Moses came down from the mountain. And in his hand he had tablets of stone that Yahweh himself had put rules for us to keep us safe. To teach us how to not be a slave nation, to teach us how to be a nation marked different from all others, so we could be a blessing to the rest of the world. When Moses saw what the people were doing, he smashed those down. And as they shattered, silence went across the camp, and the people just knew. And Moses said he would go up and beg God to forgive us. Because the first thing we had promised was that God would be our only God. We would have no other images before him. And the first thing the people did was to make another image and place it before God. And Moses went back up on the mountain. And again he was gone a while. Because he had to now hand carve out those same rules that God had given us. And the people were sorry. For Moses melted down that gold. He sprinkled the dust on the water and made them drink it. So they could not reuse the gold to make another image. And while we were there, God told him how to build a tent where his presence could be. And we called it the tabernacle. And those 2 stones were placed into a special vehicle called the Ark. And God made a covenant with us. The all-powerful, almighty God extended a hand down to us. He said, I will be your covenant partner. I will love you, and I will take care of you, and I will redeem you, and I will restore your land to you. But because of what you've done, you won't walk this way. And the people regretted it. And Moses would go to the special tent of meeting to speak to the Lord. And a pillar that led us would come down over the temple until Moses came out. And then it was time to leave. And we started on our journey together. And then something happened that I think most women have been so tempted to do what I did. And I beg you, if you have never given into it, don't. For I became jealous. And I started to speak out against him. Knowing that God had chosen him from me. Knowing that he was God's leader for the people. I think I was jealous. Because I too am a leader of the people. They love me. They look to me. The first person to have written a song for them and led them in worship. And yet, God speaks to Moses. Aaron is the priest. And so I started with him. What do you think of him marrying a Cushite wife? That's not really good for the leader, is it? And you know, Moses said nothing. It's a very humble man. But God heard me. He heard me speak to Aaron and to other leaders. And then he spoke to Moses. And I had to go and stand outside the tent with my brother. And God said, I have used prophets with my people. And they see visions. And they have dreams to hear from me. But not so with Moses. For with Moses I speak face to face, and yet you would challenge Moses. No, I wish I could undo everything I had said. I wish I could turn back the clock and take it back. But you can't. And as the cloud lifted from the tent, I looked down. My hands were covered with leprosy. White, rotting flesh came all the way. And Aaron looked at me and he turned to Moses and he said, please, Moses, beg God, not this. For leprosy would mean I would have to live outside. And Moses prayed on our behalf. And he said, please, God, I forgive them. It's okay. And God said, I forgive them, but she must still pay them. And so for 7 days, I had to be outside the camp with this disfiguring, painful disease. And 7 days doesn't sound so long, but 7 days alone, thinking about your intentions, thinking about the condition of your heart, and that you are placed here to serve, not because you're special, but because you're willing. And that willing heart is what God had seen in me as a 5-year-old. And when it had turned to pride, but God's mercy, His enormous, His grace unlimited. And after 7 days, the priest could declare me clean, for he healed me of that dreadful disease. And do you know, the people were so kind. They would not move their camp until I was well. And I could join them. And I joined them as a different man, a humble man, a Miriam who knows that God's heart is for each and every single one of his people. No one is more special than him. No one has more rights than him. For he loves each and every one equally, and he extends each of us the same love, same mercy, and same grace. And now we face our journey to the promised land. And who knows what my future is? But I know that God holds me in his hands. And whatever his will for my life is, let it be so. Thank you.